Beneath a blank page lies a truth someone tried to erase. Welcome to Detective Echoes. Share where you're tuning in from. Your voice sharpens every clue. And so our search for the unwritten manuscript begins. It was a dark February morning when I found myself crossing the threshold of 221B Baker Street again, the wind blowing through my overcoat with all the courtesy of a purse. The coal fire in Holmes's parlour crackled in the hearth, a reluctant sentinel against the cold. Holmes himself sat cross-legged on the mantelpiece, his slender figure partially silhouetted against the dim light of the grey London sky. Between his fingers, he held a slip of paper, yellowed at the corners, and from the creases on his brow I knew at once that the thing had engaged his particular attention. "You're late, Watson," he remarked without looking up. "And wet. You took the long way via Cavendish Square, I suppose. And you stopped for a moment under that dripping awning by the tobacconists." "Holmes, I'd say you were into witchcraft if—" "I didn't know," I replied, unrolling my scarf. He gave a slight smile. "Simply an observation. Your left cuff is wetter than your right, and your boots bear the imprint of that singular herringbone tile found only outside Arkwright's shop." I settled into my usual armchair, curious now to know what had captured his attention so early in the day. "And what do we have this morning? A missing baronet's greyhound, a fugitive banker's employee?" Holmes handed me the sheet of paper without a word. It was a letter typed in an old, uneven font that spoke of a worn ribbon and unknown hands. "To the attention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective. Sir, I have no name to give you, no address, and no response to this correspondence. I am not seeking help, but I am leaving you fragments of something that may soon be of great importance. Within 24 hours, a theft will be discovered. What is stolen is not gold or a jewel, but something that was never written down, and yet it was expected. A manuscript. I only say this. His absence will tear reputations like the tears of the Thames at the rotten piles. Let no one be trusted. Let no one presume. A witness who cannot be heard. There was no date, no watermark on the paper. No envelope had accompanied it, Holmes informed me, except for a plain brown wrapper delivered by boy runner at 6:30 in the morning. "Extraordinary," I murmured. "It sounds more like a cryptic warning or the prelude to a scandalous story." "Indeed, Watson. A letter with no context, no name, no tangible crime." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. "And yet it has the curious quality of inevitability, as if it were not a warning, but a certainty. Do you think this is credible?" He turned to me, his eyes shining. "Watson, I think impossible to ignore." At that moment there was a knock at the door. Before Mrs. Hudson could announce the visitor, a tall man in a rumpled blouse entered the room, his face flushed with exertion and anxiety. He held his crushed hat in his gloved hands. "Mr. Holmes, pardon the intrusion. I am Sir Giles Dunworthy of the Royal Literary Society. Something indescribable has happened." Holmes gestured for him to sit on the sofa. "Unspeakable, Sir Giles, or merely inconvenient?" Sir Giles looked at him as if struck. "The manuscript, Holmes, the one of Arthur Penrose's posthumous memoirs." "The famous political satirist." "The same thing. He died last summer, and his publisher, Mr. James Bracknell, had almost completed the compilation of his unpublished work. A slim volume entitled The Tongue of a Tyrant was due out next month. Only, yes? It's gone, every page, from a locked drawer in Bracknell's office in Bloomsbury. The room was undisturbed. The window was locked. Only the manuscript was gone." Holmes did not speak. He tapped the letter on the table, then slowly looked up. "It appears," he said, "that something that never really existed has actually been stolen." Sir Giles Dunworthy leaned forward on the edge of our sofa, his eyes passing between Holmes and me, with the expression of a man who hardly believed his own words, even as he repeated them. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes," he repeated, his voice strained. "With urgency, not a single page remains. And there were dozens of them, essays, letters, unfinished satirical columns. Penrose dictated the final notes to Bracknell before his stroke. It was all there. We were just about to send it to press." Holmes clasped his fingers under his chin and studied our visitor with interest. "Let us pause for a moment, Sir Giles. Above all, we must avoid jumping to conclusions. To understand the theft, we must understand the value of what was taken. You say this manuscript of the tongue of a tyrant. Was it a collection of unpublished writings? Indeed. Political satire, mainly. Penrose was known for his veiled attacks on the aristocracy. In Parliament, he spared no one. It might then be said, Holmes mused, that its publication might be damaging to the reputation, particularly of those who currently hold the reins of influence. "More than damage," replied Sir Giles. "It could ruin careers. A baronet, a privy councillor, perhaps even a minister of the Crown, if they recognized themselves in Penrose's portraits." Holmes stood up abruptly. "Then we must visit Mr. Bracknell without delay. I hope he is aware of your coming here." "He is," Sir Giles said, standing up as well. "In fact, it was he who begged me to contact you directly. Scotland Yard, he feared, would take the matter too publicly. And if the press got a whiff of it," Holmes was already taking off his coat, "then we will keep the matter discreet. Come, Watson." I followed Holmes down the stairs and into the street, where a black coupe hired by Sir Giles was waiting for him. As we climbed inside, the air outside seemed to sting more sharply, as if it too sensed something menacing brewing in the unseen corners of London. We arrived at an unassuming row of brick buildings in Bloomsbury, their facades as unremarkable as the dozens of bureaus and society newspapers that dotted the area. The third door bore a brass plaque, "James Bracknell, editor and publisher." Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper. Piles of bound galley proofs and marked rough drafts were stacked on every surface. A short, thinning-haired man wearing glasses greeted us, wringing his hands. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I can't tell you what a relief it is to see you." Holmes nodded quickly. "Sir Giles informed us. You are Mr. James Bracknell?" "Yes, sir." "Did you discover the theft this morning?" "Just before 7 o'clock. I'm arriving early. I usually check the correspondence before my clerk arrives." "And you came in alone?" "Always. I keep the key. There's only one other one, and it stays on the hook in my apartment. No one else has access to it." Holmes inspected the room at a glance. "And the manuscript has been preserved?" Bracknell pointed to a polished walnut desk, one drawer of which had clearly been left open. "That one?" "It was locked. It still was when I arrived. There was no sign of damage." Holmes stepped forward and crouched down to inspect the drawer. He took a magnifying glass from his pocket and carefully examined the keyhole and the inner groove of the drawer rail. Then he removed a slender finger and touched the edge of the drawer. No scratches, no pry marks, no foreign residue. He stood up. "Mr. Bracknell, do you keep track of who visits this office?" The editor hesitated. "Only vaguely. We have a large book, but I don't insist that guests sign unless they're collecting evidence or meeting by appointment." "And last week?" 3 visitors. A columnist delivering his article, a printer confirming the fonts, and, yes, a woman, Lady Fitzallen." Sir Giles made a sudden noise, halfway between a cough and a protest. Holmes turned abruptly. "Lady Fitzallen," he repeated. "She from the Fitzallen Review. I remember reading that Penrose ridiculed her family in a particularly scathing article 2 years ago. She said she had come to pay tribute to the legacy of the late Mr. Penrose, but she spent an unusual amount of time alone in that room. I was distracted preparing a proof in the next room." Holmes moved around the office like a man navigating a chessboard. his eyes flicking from object to object with quiet intensity. He paused in front of a framed photograph of Penrose and Bracknell, sitting in what appeared to be a garden. Then he moved to the wastepaper basket, rummaging through its contents with his gloved fingers. "That's a shame," he murmured. "The cleaners have already done their rounds." "No," Bracknell corrected him. "We don't have any cleaner. I empty the basket myself once a week." Holmes jerked his head up. "Then who removed the half-burnt match that should be here, or the wax shavings from the edge of the drawer?" Bracknell paled. I don't know." "This means that someone handled the waste after the theft." Sir Giles cleared his throat. "Holmes, are you suggesting that Lady Fitzallen has returned?" Holmes did not answer. He went to the window and examined the latch, feeling the sill. "There's still dust in the grooves," he said. "No forced entry. No sign of disturbance in the alley, which brings us back to the key." He turned to Bracknell. "Your spare part, can we examine it?" Bracknell took a small brass key from the inside pocket of his coat. Holmes held it up to the light, inspected the teeth, and then handed it back. "And you swear that drawer was locked when you discovered the manuscript was missing?" "I swear." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and looked thoughtful. "Then one of two things happened," he said. "Either someone duplicated your key, which requires access and time, or the drawer was never locked." Bracknell stiffened. "I always lock it, always." Holmes gave a small nod. "Of course. But the most dangerous assumption in any mystery is the belief that we know what we did, when we did it." We left the office shortly after, Holmes silent as we returned to the car. Sir Giles excused himself to return to the society, and Holmes and I headed towards the Russell Square junction, where we could hail a taxi. "Well, Holmes," I finally asked, "what do you think?" Holmes glanced at me, his eyes alive with thought. "We are, Watson, in the presence of an absence, a theft of something intangible, a manuscript that no one has read, no one has published, and yet someone is so afraid that they risked exposure to prevent it from seeing the light of day. But stealing it without breaking the lock?" Holmes stopped walking. "This suggests, dear Watson, that the manuscript never existed in the form we think." We arrived back at Baker Street in mid-afternoon, the damp fog thickening as it crept into the narrow lanes of Marylebone. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent throughout the journey, his expression fixed in that peculiar mask of detachment I had come to recognize as the sign of a mind revolving on invisible wheels. He lit no pipe, asked no rhetorical questions. Instead, he stared out of the cab window as the smog-stained outlines of London rolled by in a hazy procession. As we entered our living room, he went straight to his violin, not to play, but to put it away, looking instead for his chemical cabinet. "Watson, the ashes from the Bracknell bin, have you observed it?" "I didn't see anything other than usual," I admitted. "Scraps of paper, ink-stained fabric, maybe." "Precisely. And yet that's the problem. Should have been there wasn't. The waste-paper basket should have contained fragments, something scorched, burned, or torn. But instead, it was too clean, too uniform, as if it had been selectively emptied and refilled." Frowned. "Do you think the thief came back after the deed to hide the evidence?" Holmes set about preparing some reagents, nitrate, aniline dye, potassium permanganate. "I think, Watson, that the thief was not only interested in the suppression of the manuscript, but in the printing of common had disappeared. It's one thing to steal a document, it's another to erase the same one, tracer of his existence. Surely Bracknell couldn't have invented the manuscript?" I asked more cautiously now. Holmes turned and gave me a sharp, analytical, but not unsympathetic look. "Not invented, perhaps, but exaggerated. Let's consider the possibilities. Suppose Penrose left behind only scattered notes, incomplete. Drafts, vague thoughts in the margins of the correspondence. A true manuscript may never have existed in any compelling or coherent form. Yet the idea of that has power. I sank back in my chair, considering the implications. And such an idea could be stolen? Holmes smiled weakly. Not literally, but it could be deleted, especially if someone was afraid of what might happen of these fragments. He returned to his work table and began preparing a slide, placing a dark grey powder under a lens. But first, let's confirm what type of ash we're dealing with. While he peered through the microscope, I turned to the window. The street was shrouded in fog, cars clanging like ghosts beyond a veil. There was something unsettling about the whole affair, something that reminded me of our more subtle cases, those not of violence or theft, but of influence and perception. "Huh?" Holmes exclaimed softly. "As I suspected. These ashes didn't come from ordinary paper. See the granulation? There, streaks of charred flax pulp, high in fibre. This came from rag paper, the kind used for printing proofs or older letters. Not recent manuscripts," I joined him. "So whatever was burned in the Bracknell office was not the manuscript?" "No," said Holmes. "But it was done to give the impression that it was possible, a clever deception. The question is, why destroy something other than the manuscript, and then suggest that the latter has disappeared?" The doorbell rang downstairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's light footsteps and a knock on our bedroom door. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, ushering in a tall man with high cheekbones and a stooped posture. He removed his hat, revealing a halo of untamed grey hair. "Inspector Lestrade, how I live and breathe," I said, surprised. Holmes beckoned him in. "Lestrade, I was wondering when the yard would start revolving around this little ghost story." Lestrade grimaced. "Not here officially, Holmes. Between you and me, something came across my desk that, well, it might intersect with one of your little escapades." "Speak." "Freely," said Holmes, pointing to the carafe. Lestrade ignored the offer. "A woman was seen leaving the Bracknell building the evening before the manuscript disappeared. Tall, veiled, elegantly dressed. The clerk in the building opposite thought her car was waiting several doors down. The driver was obscured by mist." Holmes nodded. "And you think this has something to do with the Fitzallen woman who came to visit us earlier this week?" Lestrade shrugged. "The name was mentioned at the yard this morning. Lady Fitzallen's name was whispered in several quiet corners of Whitehall. Apparently, she has connections with more than just literary circles. Her husband, before his death, served on a parliamentary scrutiny committee that examined certain colonial expenditures." Holmes's eyes glittered. "How very curious. Colonial expenditure, Watson. Those curious little budgets that seem to evaporate without public scrutiny. And Penrose, if my memory serves me right, had just returned from Cairo. Shortly before his fatal arrest." Lestrade raised his eyebrows. "So you think Penrose wrote something sensitive?" "I think," said Holmes, rising, "that Penrose may have begun write something sensitive, or at least intended to do so, and that Bracknell perhaps saw in the fragments a chance to evoke prestige or profit, and someone else saw in these fragments a danger." Lestrade glanced toward the window. "Holmes, this may be bigger than literary gossip." Holmes tapped the cryptic letter we had received that morning. "You are, of course, quite right, Lestrade. That warning was no joke. And if I'm not mistaken, someone is not only erasing the manuscript from existence, but also erasing all manuscripts. Memory of this. Later that evening, Holmes and I paid a discreet visit to the Royal Literary Society. Sir Giles Dunworthy received us in his dimly lit office, surrounded by piles of correspondence and galleys like defensive ramparts. The fire died down in the hearth, but even it seemed subdued. "You wanted to examine the Penrose effects?" he asked. "More specifically," Holmes said, Any unpublished material, letters, marginalia, even satirical drafts, never intended for public consumption. Sir Giles retrieved a box from a locked cabinet. That's all he left behind. Bracknell had the rest. Holmes removed a single page and placed it in the firelight. A poem, or perhaps the beginning of one. O Empire, fragile dressed in lace, she could be betrayed by the mask and the grace. The great book is filled with blood and ink, and those who read can stop thinking. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the box. I believe, he said softly, that our missing manuscript was never a book, but a threat to a truth that someone feared would be recreated. And in such a shadow play, even a page becomes a weapon. Sir Giles's expression darkened. Then what do you propose to do, Holmes? Holmes looked towards the fire. I propose, he said, to bait the trap. The next morning, dawn was covered with a thick fog, the kind that turned even the familiar steps of Baker Street into stone spectres. I found Holmes already dressed, pacing our drawing-room with the quick, silent steps of an overworked mind. On the table before him were three objects: the enigmatic letter from the anonymous correspondent, the verse we had recovered from the personal effects of the late Arthur Penrose, and a small flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. Watson, he said, as I entered, do you remember the exact sentence in the letter delivered yesterday? I wiped the sleep from my eyes. What is stolen is not gold or a jewel, but something that was never written down. Precisely. The wording is very deliberate. Never written, not just unpublished. It implies something else entirely. The idea of a manuscript that exists in rumor, in waiting, but perhaps never took shape. And yet, someone feared its potential. Enough to erase its remains. He patted the package. This morning's mail, delivered with no return address, of course. Inside, a single sheet, no letterhead, no signature, but I recognized the font. Bracknell's typewriter. I moved closer. The page contained only one sentence, aligned in the center, neatly against the white. He who keeps silent holds the blade. I looked towards Holmes. Meaning? I asked. He gave me this unreadable smile. That someone wants us to Beverly aware that we are moving into dangerous waters. The blade here is probably figurative, but the danger is not. He put on his coat and grabbed his gloves. Come on, Watson. We must visit Lady Fitzallen. Lady Fitzallen resided in a tall, narrow townhouse in Belgravia, its exterior immaculate, and discreetly guarded by a sort of uniformed porter who recognized influential names and politely discouraged questions. Holmes handed us a business card, and a few minutes later we were shown into a high-ceilinged drawing-room furnished in deep burgundy and forest green. The lady herself entered with feline grace, her dark gown setting off the alabaster of her skin. A fishnet veil hung over her, eyes though it was more affectation than mourning. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said in a soft, uninflected voice. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service. May I introduce my associate, Dr. John Watson?" She gave me a slight nod, before settling into a high-backed chair. "I heard you asked about me yesterday," she said, folding her gloved hands. "We are investigating the disappearance of the Penrose manuscript," Holmes replied. She gave a light, musical laugh. "This tedious business, I understand it's driving the Literary Society hysterical." "You visited Mr. Bracknell's study last week," Holmes said. "According to his own account, you were alone in the manuscript room for nearly a quarter of an hour." "I was admiring a bust of Cicero," she said lightly. "Rather flattering, I thought." Holmes smiled weakly. "Lady Fitzallen, you seem to me to be a woman who wastes neither time nor words. Penrose ridiculed your family in a posthumously published column. His unpublished works, we understand, may contain more inflammatory observations. She tilted her head. And you think I stole them? I think you had an interest in ensuring they never reached the public. Whether that interest was personal or political remains unclear. A long silence stretched between them. Then she raised her hand and lifted her veil. You are intelligent, Mr. Holmes, she said, her tone losing its performative elegance. But not omniscient. Yes, I have visited Bracknell. Yes, I have read the fragments. He showed them to me himself. I left him a nice donation for the society and continued on my way. You deny coming back the night of the disappearance? Categorically. So tell me, said Holmes, moving closer, what was in those pages? What frightened? You enough to try to confine it? She hesitated. Something flickered behind her eyes. Penrose mentioned a fund, she said finally. An account set up under a false name. It appeared only once in his notes, under a coded heading. He thought it was linked to an overseas operation. My late husband's committee may have overseen it, yes, but the implication, if published, would be scandalous beyond belief. Did Bracknell seem alarmed by this? Not at all. He seemed almost pleased. I got the impression he thought this involvement would increase the value of the manuscript. Maybe it would. But if someone else read these same lines, someone with more to lose, they might decide to make the manuscript disappear. Altogether, I said. His eyes turned to me. Exactly. Holmes crossed his arms. Who else knew about your visit? Nobody. At least, not according to my conception. And the fund, was it ever explicitly named? She shook her head. Just a pseudonym. Aegis Mercury. This was the name used in the notes. Holmes turned abruptly. Are you sure? Positive. I remember it because of the strange juxtaposition. Aegis for protection, Mercury for speed or perhaps deception. As we walked down the steps of her house, Holmes spoke as if thinking aloud. Aegis Mercury, Watson. The expression is unknown to me in any official context, but it is the smell of code names, clandestine operations, and possibly state secrets. Do you think Penrose discovered anything authentic? I think he's discovered enough to be dangerous, even in an incomplete form. And now we know that the stakes aren't just reputational, they're institutional. We had barely returned to Baker Street when a telegram was waiting for us. It read, to Holmes, stop. Confirmed that the print proofs were scheduled for Tyrant's Tongue. Stop. Press plates never delivered. Stop. Bracknell has been missing since noon. Stop. Lestrade Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me with a somber expression. So, I said, the editor disappears. Holmes's voice was cold. No, Watson, he's not disappearing. He disappeared. We were at the Bracknell apartment within the hour. The building's caretaker hadn't seen him since morning. His apartment was a mess, but not in the way one might expect from a struggle. Everything was too neat, tidy, arranged, and strangely impersonal. The study was emptied. A single book remained open on the bedside table, Julius Caesar. Holmes bent down to examine it. The passage has been underlined in pencil. Let me have fat men around me, men with elegant heads who sleep at night. He gently closed the book. Watson, there's something profoundly wrong with this image. It's the illusion of order, but behind it lies either coercion or fear. That evening, Holmes made no effort to conceal his agitation. He resumed pacing only to jot down calculations or mutter Latin phrases under his breath. At midnight he stood at the window, his silhouette barely distinguishable from the night outside. I spoke softly. Holmes, what are we chasing? He turned, his face pale but resolute. Not just a thief, Watson, not just a saboteur. We're chasing a narrative, the one that someone is desperate to smother before it is assembled. At Bracknell, he has the last piece. and they want to stop him from giving it away. The next morning, Holmes was already on the move, each step cut with precision and purpose. He had barely touched his breakfast. He had simply stirred the yolk of his egg into a slimy pool and set the plate aside. The fog, if anything, had grown denser, and the gas lamps outside shone like spectral orbs, trapped in gauze. But Holmes's eyes were even brighter. "We need to find what Bracknell left behind," he said abruptly. "His disappearance wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was orchestrated, and I'd bet anything he'd intended to do so before he was intercepted. Do you think he was silenced?" I asked. Holmes paused as he buttoned his coat, then nodded briefly. "Perhaps. More likely he was sequestered, detained, or hidden until those behind this orchestration decided how best to contain the damage. The mistake his captors made, if they are indeed professionals, was to assume that Bracknell was merely a passive intermediary, but from what I saw he thought he was more. Plus, a gambler, Watson, a man who believed he had something of value and intended to trade with it. Our first stop was Bracknell's private composing office, a small rented room above, a tailor's shop on St. Bride's Lane, just off Fleet Street. Bracknell had kept this space separate from the Literary Society's official premises, no doubt for reasons befitting his dual role as editor and speculative pamphleteer. The key to the room had been obtained by Lestrade the previous evening, and through quick negotiations, Holmes had secured our access. Inside, the place smelled of old ink and burnt metal. In one corner was a typesetter's cabinet, with drawers neatly arranged by font and size. The galley proofs were stacked in a crate next to the press, some marked, others wrapped in string. Holmes moved like a ghost through the room, his eyes scanning every surface for irregularities. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to a folded piece of paper protruding from the spine of a large book. He carefully removed it and unfolded it with gloved hands. Typewritten notes, not in Bracknell's hand but on his typewriter. He passed it to me. It was a paragraph, heavily crossed out in pencil as if it were meant to be discarded. They buried it under the subcommittee, disguised as agricultural study accounts. But it wasn't a study. The true purpose of Aegis Mercury went beyond any English domain. I looked at him. Agricultural study. That seems like an absurd cover. Holmes laughed. Absurd, yes, but effective. Bureaucracy is the best place to hide something important. People think boring is synonymous with harmlessness. He turned to a wall-mounted notice board. Clippings, letters, and newspaper fragments were pinned to it in no particular order. One, in particular, caught Holmes's attention. A small envelope addressed to H. Canning, Archives de la Rue Penrith. Holmes patted him lightly. "Watson, write down that name. I believe Mr. Bracknell had initiated some sort of correspondence, either requesting a records check or attempting to locate something from Penrose's past. This Canning man might contain a missing link. But if Bracknell has been intercepted," I said, "they may already be watching Canning." "Exactly," said Holmes, already turning towards the door. Late in the morning we arrived at the Penrith Street Archives, a cavernous red brick structure housing surplus documents from several government departments. Inside, the air was cool and dry, and a smell of old leather and mildew hung in the corridors. A clerk directed us to a side office, where we found Mr. H. Canning, slender, scholarly, and half buried under a pile of bound reports. He adjusted his glasses as we introduced ourselves, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, Mr. Bracknell has corresponded with me. He sent me a rather curious inquiry concerning a Colonial Office expenditure report, 1887, I think." Holmes looked forward to the meeting. "And what does the report show?" "Very little at first glance, but he requested specific allocations related to agricultural extension programs in the Levant." I dug deeper. The funds were indeed intended for studies on barley and wheat, But the amounts, considerable I should say, never matched the actual logbooks, a discrepancy of nearly £7,000. A ghost account? I asked. Worse, Canning said. A ghost project. Holmes leaned forward. And the name Aegis Mercury? Canning nodded. That sentence appears scribbled in the margin of a requisition file. No official mention, but it's there in pencil faintly, as if added hastily or in secret. I thought it was a labeling error. Holmes smiled. No, Mr. Canning. That's why Bracknell was silenced. We left the archives in eerie silence. Holmes's long strides carried him swiftly through the foggy streets, his head bowed in thought. It was only when we were almost at the platform that he spoke again. The truth is beginning to resolve itself, Watson. Penrose came across a slush fund, a secret allowance probably used for espionage or bribery, or something altogether less savory during our imperial misadventures. He wrote it down, veiled in satire. Bracknell, seeing its value, kept the fragments with the intention of publishing them, or perhaps trading them for influence. And now, others have noticed. But who, Holmes? And why hide it now, years after? Penrose first discovered it. Because the mechanism probably still exists, Holmes said. The names have changed, the institutions persist. Someone fears that even a veiled accusation could trigger an investigation, which could unearth more than a few skeletons. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes compiled the notes of our investigation with an unusual method. Each clue was pinned, circled, or labelled on his board. Dame Fitzallen, Bracknell, Penrose, Canning, Aegis Mercury. Then, in the centre, he pinned a single word, leverage. There's one player left, he said aloud, someone who's remained invisible until now, someone who risked losing not just their reputation, but maybe everything. And that someone has resources, surveillance, containment, maybe even government support. I felt a thrill that wasn't due to the weather. Do you think Bracknell is still alive? Holmes didn't answer at first. Then, if they demand his silence, dead men are more dangerous than the living. He can still be used to mislead, redirect, discredit. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Holmes opened it cautiously. A boy was standing there, panting, holding a sealed envelope. For Mr. Holmes, he said it was urgent, sir. Holmes took it and gave the boy a coin before closing the door. He carefully broke the seal. Inside, a blurry, grainy but unmistakable photograph of Bracknell, seated at a table, flanked by two men in plain dark suits. His eyes, even in grain, were hollow. Below the photo, a single line typed on a strip of paper. He still thinks he's holding the pen. Holmes looked at it for a long time, then placed it on the mantel. It seems, he said coldly, our invisible adversary has just sent a warning. Holmes placed the blurry photograph of Bracknell against the mantelpiece and stepped back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The fire crackled softly behind him, casting long shadows across the room, but his face was unreadable, a sculpted mask of concentration and restraint. The message was clear. Bracknell was alive, but being watched, manipulated, or imprisoned. The threat implied in the words "he still thinks he holds the pen" was as psychological as it was physical. Whoever had taken Bracknell now sought to control the narrative, not simply suppress it. The photograph was a warning, certainly, but also a demonstration of power. A demonstration that they saw Holmes's progress and were not above intimidation. He's being used, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. Not entirely silenced yet, which means they still demand something from him. Perhaps authentication. Or perhaps, Watson, what's the most dangerous thing a man can possess when the truth is used as a weapon? I thought about it, then answered slowly. Credibility. Holmes gave a small nod. Indeed. With Bracknell's name attached, any fragment of Penrose's notes becomes more than gossip. It becomes subversion. And now? Now, said Holmes softly, we get the man back. That evening, Holmes asked me to prepare for a night excursion. He sent no telegrams, wrote no notes, made no inquiries through official channels. When I asked where we were going, he simply replied, to listen for footsteps where none should fall. We set off in the dark and headed by hired taxi towards the south bank of the Thames. It was close to midnight when we arrived at Lambeth Marsh, a stretch of disused docks, industrial ruins, and sooty alleyways. The fog was thicker here, dense with the smell of coal smoke and river water. Holmes led the way, turning down a narrow street behind the remains of an abandoned warehouse. The place was silent except for the distant roar of engines and the clink of chains somewhere out on the river. "I received this address from a most unlikely source," Holmes said, as we stopped by a rusty iron gate. "A street singer near Penrith. Street. She claims a man fitting the description from Bracknell was seen getting into a car late last night. The car returned here, without him. Did someone pay her to forget? She said the coin was heavier than her memory," Holmes replied, "but she remembered enough of it." He took out a slim set of tools and easily picked the lock on the gate. We slipped through and entered a courtyard surrounded by crumbling brick walls. A faint yellow light shone behind a tall window on the far side. Holmes signaled for silence and approached the structure. We reached the door and paused. Then gently he tried the latch. It gave way with surprising ease. Inside was a long corridor lined with closed doors. The air was hot, too hot, and smelled of stale pipe tobacco and ink. We walked silently down the corridor. Halfway down, Holmes signaled me to stop. He knelt by the left-hand door, examining the threshold, then reached into his coat and pulled out a thin mirror attached to a telescopic pole. Through the gap, we saw a man sitting at a desk, his shoulders slumped. It was Bracknell. His wrists weren't bound, but his expression was blank. He sat in front of a single candle, his hand resting on a blank sheet of paper. Two men in dark suits stood at the back of the room, conversing in low voices. On the desk were a stack of parchment, a half-full inkwell, and a revolver, positioned not as a threat but as a symbol. Holmes removed the mirror and whispered, "They're destroying him, slowly. Forcing him to recant, perhaps to write a false account. Once he signs it, the manuscript will be officially discredited. But how can we get him out?" I whispered. Holmes rummaged in his coat again. "We don't need to simply remove it, Watson. We need to make it impossible to use." He handed me a folded sheet, one of the reproductions he had made of Penrose's original notes, skillfully forged in Bracknell's typographic style. "If they lose control of the narrative," Holmes said, "they lose everything." He slipped into the corridor and headed for a narrow staircase at the rear of the building. I followed. We climbed slowly, avoiding the creaking floorboards. On the upper floor, Holmes entered a small side room filled with dusty crates and ledgers. There, with deliberate care, he placed the fake sheet in an open ledger, pinning it next to a fake envelope addressed to a fictitious cousin of Penrose. Then he lit the corner with a match and quickly extinguished it, creating the illusion of interrupted destruction. "The room below must be left behind with all haste," he said. "They will discover it when they return. The document will cast doubt, not on the manuscript but on its suppression. They will suspect Bracknell of having betrayed them, and then they will flee." 10 minutes later, Holmes created a subtle distraction. A deactivated fuse box followed by a burst of light and smoke from a lamp on the ground floor. Screams echoed. The two men guarding Bracknell rushed from the room. Holmes and I moved quickly and entered as Bracknell looked up in alarm. "Mr. Holmes?" he said hoarsely. Holmes nodded briefly. "You're safe now. Can you walk?" Bracknell stood up slowly. He looked thinner, his eyes bloodshot, but the fire inside him wasn't yet extinguished. Yes, I think I can." Together, we exited through the back of the building and into the alley. Within minutes, Bracknell was bundled into a taxi in T. Route to a safe house in South Kensington, prearranged with one of Holmes's most discreet contacts. As the car rolled through the deserted streets, Bracknell finally spoke. They told me to sign a statement claiming the manuscript was fabricated, that Penrose had left nothing but incoherent ramblings. They said it would make it look like I was trying to sell fake political satire to foreign agents, that I would be ruined. They wanted to make you the villain, Holmes said. But they forgot that you were a printer, a man who knows how to hide a message in the margins. Bracknell looked at Holmes with quiet gratitude. So you believe me, that the manuscript was real, at least in substance? Holmes nodded. Not in the conventional sense, but the fragments, those lines, those allusions were real enough to hurt, and in the right hands real enough to be exposed. I watched Holmes as he leaned back in the taxi, his eyes closed now, his breathing calm for the first time in days. But I knew the case wasn't closed yet. The manuscript was never a single object. It was a storm of fragments, a storm that was feared to turn into a map. And even though we now had Bracknell, those who had tried to suppress the truth had not yet disappeared into the fog. No, they had only withdrawn. For now. Bracknell remained under Holmes's protection for the next 48 hours, sequestered in a modest spare room above a shoemaker's in South Kensington, a location arranged by Holmes through a quiet understanding with a former informer turned tradesman. The location was unknown to anyone else. Even Lestrade was informed only that the publisher had been recovered safe and sound and would be available in due course. During those 2 days, Holmes barely slept. He moved like a possessed man, flitting between 221B Baker Street and the hidden corners of London, with all the invisible dexterity of a shadow. From the reading rooms of the British Museum to the Colonial Archives Register Office, he traced a thread through a tapestry of bureaucracy and buried scandals. Meanwhile, I stayed with Bracknell. The man was recovering physically, but the ordeal had taken its toll. He often sat silently, staring out the window, his eyes scanning the rooftops across the street, as if expecting a figure to emerge. On the second evening, as I poured him a cup of weak tea, he finally spoke. "Do you think I've been a fool, Dr. Watson?" I looked up from my seat. "For preserving Penrose's notes? For seeing their value? No. Perhaps you were reckless, but not stupid." He shook his head slowly. "I thought I could control the narrative, that by carefully manipulating it, I could steer it where it would do the most good or the least harm. And instead," he met my gaze, "instead, I underestimated how many people do not desire the truth, but only its silence." Holmes returned. Late in the evening, his coat stiff with cold, his eyes shining with something between satisfaction and unease. "I found our key," he announced without preamble. "But as is often the case, the door it opens isn't the one I expected." He placed a thin folder on the table between us. Inside were copies, official, notarized and annotated, of the parliamentary expense reports for the years 1887 to 1889. Holmes pointed to a particular column under the Agricultural Outreach Subcommittee. "There," he said, patting a figure that seemed completely ordinary to me. £8,000, I asked. "Allocated for barley production trials in Alexandria," Holmes finished. "A region of Egypt known for its dry grain, but historically resistant to English import attempts. And yet not a single shipment left the port. Not a single recorded invoice for seed, transport, or personnel. And here," he turned the page, "is the accompanying footnote, handwritten, initialed only D." The note read, "C.M. file for ministerial approval." "No further breakdown is required." I frowned. "Am Aegis Mercury?" Holmes nodded. A reference so discreet it passes for departmental shorthand, but that's where it gets really interesting. He produced a second document, one of the few surviving pages of Penrose's private letters, obtained from Sir Giles Dunworthy under the guise of literary verification. "There," said Holmes, pointing to a sentence, "Aegis Mercury, the ghost behind the plough. They bury the blood in the barley and expect us to taste only the grain." I looked up slowly. "That's not satire. That's an accusation." "That's true," Holmes said. "And that means Penrose had access, perhaps through a contact at the Ministry, to knowledge of this fraud. And he left the trail for us, disguised as a metaphor, waiting for someone to read between the lines." "But why not denounce him directly?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Because there are truths so powerful, so tangled in the machinery of power, that stating them clearly invites your own discredit. Penrose understood this, so he wrote it in riddles and rhymes so that it might live even when expurgated." The next day, Holmes requested a private meeting with Lady Fitzallen. To my surprise, she agreed. We met her in the British Museum's public reading room, beneath the vaulted dome, and among scholars, students, and discreet men with ink-stained intentions. She wore mourning black, her veil back in place, but it was no longer an affectation. This time it seemed she was wearing not a costume but a shield. "I received your message," she said quietly. "I hope this will be discreet." Holmes inclined his head. "To a point, though I fear discretion is a rapidly losing currency." He handed her a folder containing copies of the same reports we'd discovered. She scanned them expressionlessly until she reached the footnote, then looked up. "You found the allowance." "I found what Penrose saw," Holmes said, "and what Bracknell preserved. I also found what your husband helped hide." She tensed. "He wasn't the architect." "But he was the keeper of the safe," replied Holmes, "and now the locks are rusting." She gently closed the file. "And what do you expect me to do with this?" "Tell the truth," said Holmes, "or let it be told. The men who took Bracknell will not stop, but they will back off if they realize the silence is broken." His fingers gripped the edge of the backrest. "You're asking me to reveal my family's name?" "No," said Holmes. "I ask you to get yours back." A silence fell between them, tense, charged, like the last moment before the bell tolls. Finally she said, "I'll think about it." Holmes gave him a small bow. "Think quickly." That evening we returned to Baker Street to find a curious package waiting for us. It had no return address, but it bore the seal of the Colonial Investigation Bureau, and inside were 3 pages of dense, typed text. At first glance, it was a list of trade routes and grain yield projections. But as Holmes scanned it, he smiled. "That's an apology," he said softly. "For what?" "For not having seen sooner." He handed me the second page. Among the data tables was a paragraph of summary text with this curious line: "Performance shortfall. Due to transport failure. AM was ordered to redirect allocation. Authorization not filed." It was an internal confession, a bureaucratic phantom memo that acknowledged the existence of a phantom fund without ever naming it. And in bureaucratic language, it was as close to a confession as you could get. Holmes patted him lightly. "Whoever sent this wants us to know they exist and are listening to us. But more importantly, they want us to know, believe." The final twist came not from the corridors of power, but from Bracknell itself. 3 days after his recovery, he returned to the Royal Literary Society to deliver a sealed envelope to Sir Giles Dunworthy. Inside was a preface, unsigned, unfinished, intended to accompany Penrose's lost writings. It read, "The pen doesn't always write what is certain. Sometimes it scratches until blood appears. Sometimes the truth it carves is not yet understood, even by the one who wields it. But it waits. It waits in the folds of forgotten drawers, in the stuttering presses of frightened men, and in the crooked margins of every lie. Sir Giles wept softly as he read it. Holmes, standing at the window, simply lit his pipe and looked out into the London twilight. It was never about what was written, he said finally. It was about what was almost written and what it almost forced the world to see. The next few days passed in that strange, fertile silence that often precedes a storm in Holmes's world. Not a meteorological storm, but a revelation. The manuscript that had never really existed, a scattered collection of implications, memories, and metaphors, was beginning to solidify. Not on paper, not in bound chapters or inked sheets, but as a result. The truth was rising like a mist, over the moors, indistinct, elusive, and yet undeniable. Holmes's Baker Street lodgings took on the appearance of a war room. The desk was covered with a multitude of memos, typewritten fragments, and parliamentary minutes, each pinned or scribbled in his angular hand. Diagrams formed and vanished. Notes were burned almost as quickly as they were written. On the 4th day since Bracknell's recovery, Holmes turned away from his desk with the air of a man who had solved a riddle no one else knew had been posed. "We're not finished, Watson," he said, finally putting down a paperweight. "We're simply at the dawn of clarity." "I thought we already had the truth," I said. "Penrose's notes, the hidden account, the suppressed reports, that's probably all." Holmes smiled slightly. "Ah, but you confuse the truth with the entire truth. You remember, of course, the photo that was sent to us, the one of Bracknell at the table, of course. Look again." He handed me a new copy, slightly enlarged. My gaze fell on Bracknell's tired figure, sitting under a gas lamp, his hands on a typewriter. "The machine," Holmes said quietly. "Have you noticed anything unusual?" I looked at him. "It's not the one in his office." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Bracknell's usual typewriter is a Remington Model 6 with a worn E key and a slightly raised comma. The one in the photo is newer, cleaner. A Royal Barlock hybrid, common in foreign diplomatic offices, especially in Cairo." I blinked. "You think Bracknell had to retype the manuscript?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that he was brought to create a new version of it. A fake, constructed from fragments, intended to discredit not only Penrose, but the very idea of dissent." He walked over to the fireplace where the flames hissed softly. "Consider it, Watson. If one wanted to bury a dangerous tale, one could burn it. But a better way? Publish a version so exaggerated, so clumsily inflammatory, that no respectable newspaper would touch it. Then when the real notes emerge, if they do, they will be dismissed as part of the same fabrication. And Bracknell was their tool. A reluctant person," Holmes murmured. "But they almost succeeded." He turned to me, and I saw the determination in his eyes. "Which means, my friend, that we must now play the role they have prepared for us." That same evening, Holmes arranged a discreet meeting in the underground printing works of a newspaper known for its radical editorial staff. The Metropolitan Gazette. It was not a prestigious publication, nor widely read among London's elite, but its editor, Mr. Lionel Quimby, was a man with a long memory and a taste for the scandalous truth. Holmes presented Quimby with a sanitized summary of Penrose's surviving notes, along with the documentation Holmes had compiled on the missing funds, and their euphemistic paper trail. It wasn't quite enough for a legal revelation, but it was more than enough to fuel rumors. "Do you want me to run this?" Quimby asked, his fingers drumming against the desk. "You'll be hounded by the entire Treasury Board by dawn." "I expect nothing less," Holmes said, "and that's precisely the point." Because the moment. "They rise up to cancel it," Holmes replied. "They reveal the lines we left invisible. Their reaction will be confession. Quimby gave a wicked smile. Mr. Holmes, I think I appreciate your kind of trouble. The newspaper hit the streets 2 days later. Its headline was printed in bold ink, "A ghost in the Count, what was buried beneath the barley trade." The article contained no direct accusations. It claimed no conspiracy. But it did ask questions, pointed ones. Why was agricultural funding in Egypt channeled through a closed committee? Why did ministerial papers disappear from the public record? Why had Arthur Penrose, in his final months, scribbled rhymes about barley steeped in silence and empire nourished by shadow? The response was immediate. 3 newspapers dismissed it as nonsense within 24 hours. An official rebuttal was published by the Colonial Office at the end of the week, describing the claims as a deliberate misinterpretation of harmless administrative lapses. But the denial came too quickly and from too many sources. Curious, readers wrote letters, young journalists began digging, and at least one backbencher asked a question in the Commons. Holmes had struck a match, not to ignite the truth, but to test who was rushing to smother the flame. It was the second article that triggered the chain reaction. 2 days after the premiere, a letter appeared in the correspondence section of the Gazette. It was unsigned but carefully worded, and quoted specific phrases from internal memoranda that had never been published. Holmes, after reading it, immediately got up. "They're starting to fracture," he said. "Who?" I asked. "The very ones who sought to bury this. One of them is breaking ranks, a warning perhaps, or the prelude to a revelation." He tapped out a single sentence from the letter, underlined in red pencil. If Aegis Mercury was nothing, why was a man locked in a room to rewrite it? Holmes smiled grimly. "That sentence will resonate." That evening, Bracknell walked to Baker Street for the first time since his release. He looked pale but composed. His jacket was pressed. He walked with the cautious confidence of a man relearning his steps. He sat by the fire and looked at it for a long time before speaking. "You have done what I could not," he said. "You have. Given form to what was only smoke." Holmes poured him a glass of brandy. "Don't smoke," he said. "Ashes. The remains of something burned because it frightened powerful men." Bracknell took the glass, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. Old, worn, with the spine almost missing. He handed it to Holmes. "I kept one thing," he said. "Not a complete draft. Not even part of the manuscript, just Penrose's notes, from the day he returned from Cairo." Holmes opened it. Inside were fragments, poems, clipped sentences, stray phrases. One of them immediately stood out. They demanded crops and counted bribes. They weighed the grain and fed the lies, and when I wrote it, they cooled off. "For truth is wheat, but it cannot be sold." Holmes closed the book respectfully. "This," he said, "is the real manuscript. The world will never see the tongue of a Tyrantus Penrose had imagined. The entire volume was lost, unwritten, dispersed, or destroyed. But in its place, Holmes had helped construct something else, a narrative of absence, a pressure against silence, enough to raise questions, enough to open doors. Whether prosecutions would follow, whether resignations would take place, Holmes didn't speculate. He had always preferred the game of shadows to the theatre of the courts. But in the game we had won the crucial round. I remember asking him a few days later as we sat by the fire, "Do you think Penrose intended for this to happen?" Holmes thought. "I think," he said, "that some truths are not written in ink, but in fear. And it is our task, Watson, to read the margins." It was the morning after the Gazette published his 3rd article when I first noticed him. The man with the black umbrella. I had taken my usual seat by the Baker Street window, leafing through the day's edition of the Times, when I saw the figure across the street. He was standing motionless near the iron fence in front of our building, angled just enough to avoid any suspicion of direct observation. He was dressed neatly, but not fashionably. A charcoal coat, a bowler hat, and the aforementioned umbrella, which he held vertically like a walking stick rather than to protect himself from the morning mist. I put down the newspaper and watched him for a full minute. He wasn't smoking, moving, or shifting his weight. He wasn't waiting for anyone and didn't seem distracted. He was, undeniably, watching the entrance to 221B. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "it seems we have company." Holmes stood in front of the fireplace, adjusting the position of a newly pinned sheet, a complex diagram showing the flow of funds from various government departments to an account labeled AM. He followed my gaze without speaking, his eyes narrowing toward the figure across the street. "Yes," he murmured, "our discreet friend has returned. This is the third time in 4 days he's occupied this post. Mornings only, no attempts to approach, always left by noon. Did you know he was here?" "Of course. And you didn't do anything?" Holmes turned away from the window and pointed at the map. "Why would anyone touch a line that hasn't yet shown its end?" I frowned. "Do you think he's part of the government?" "No doubt. But which part of government is the greatest mystery? We now surround a sphere not of crime, Watson, but of containment, where secrets are weighed against silence. The man with the umbrella is not here to observe, we but to observe what we choose to do next. So what duty will we do then?" Holmes's response was unexpected. "We will attend a luncheon." The invitation had arrived the day before in a crisp paper envelope, engraved with the Fitzalan estate seal. It was addressed only to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but included the note, "Dr. Watson's presence is presumed and welcome." Lady Fitzalan, it seemed, was prepared to speak more frankly than she had done in the quiet of the British Museum. At exactly the right hour, we arrived at a discreet private dining room in a Mayfair club known only to the inner circle of former cabinet members and aging military attachés. The air was rich with the scent of mahogany polish and roast venison. A single attendant greeted us and led us past a velvet curtain into a room where Lady Fitzalan waited alone at a small, round table dressed in muted greys and wearing a delicate pearl brooch. She didn't stand up. Instead, she gestured for us to sit down. "No reporters," she said. "No eyes, no file." Holmes inclined his head. "You have our discretion." "I've decided to give you what you're looking for," she said without preamble. "Because the truth is, I no longer know what protection means when the disease has already spread." She removed a small leather folder from her bag. Inside, neatly arranged, were copies of the original 1887 budget approvals, internal Foreign Office memoranda, and a single letter, handwritten and unsigned, whose contents, if authenticated, would bring shame to 3 men still holding government positions. "I kept them," she said, "not out of malice, but in case one day I needed to prove that I was never one of them." Holmes examined the documents respectfully. When he came to the letter, he stopped and read it 3 times. "The style," he murmured. "Wordy, calculated. That can only be Lord Hymir." Lady Fitzalan said nothing, but her look confirmed his supposition. "And now you give it to me?" "I defer to the idea of correction," she said softly. "Whether or not that idea still has a place in Whitehall, I cannot say. But you were right, this was not a manuscript. This was a story that could no longer be left untold." Holmes folded the file and slipped it into his coat. "You do realize they can turn against you?" "I've already been exiled," she said with a bitter smile. "What's left is for me to choose." That evening, Holmes took every precaution to make duplicates of the files. One batch was delivered to a solicitor in Edinburgh. One was enclosed in a lead-lined box and hidden in the floorboards under the Baker Street foyer. And a third, carried personally by Holmes, was delivered to Lionel Quimby of the Gazette with instructions. If anything should happen to me or Mr. Bracknell, print this in its entirety. Every page. "Are we in danger now?" I asked, after Holmes returned. He smiled grimly. "No more than usual. But the difference now is that we are expected be." The next morning the man with the black umbrella was gone. In his place stood a different figure, smaller with broader shoulders, carrying a leather bag and wearing glasses so polished they reflected the street behind him. Holmes saw him and said only, "Now they're sending the clerks." At noon another letter arrived. "Unsigned, typed and brief, you've made your point. The article will be retracted. An official statement will be issued. Bracknell will be discredited. Don't pursue the rest. Let the manuscript remain unwritten. Let the story end here." Holmes handed me the letter and said nothing. Later that evening he met Bracknell again. The editor was thin but resolute, his eyes sharper now than they had been since his captivity. He understood what was being asked of him. "Am I disappearing again?" he asked. "No," Holmes replied. "You don't disappear. You become silent, but visible. You withdraw from the public eye, but not from life. You live, Mr. Bracknell. You live to remind them that you still could speak, and that's enough power." Bracknell nodded. "Then let them wonder." In the weeks that followed, the Gazette articles remained, but all publications ceased. Other newspapers refused to follow suit. No arrests were made. No officials resigned. But quiet changes did appear. Some departments were restructured. Some committee heads retired. And some files, once sealed, were discreetly transferred to archives where eyes were less forgiving. The public will never hear the whole truth, but they would feel the weight of it. Holmes, as always, seemed unaffected by the lack of headlines. "Justice, Watson," he said one foggy morning, "rarely arrives with fanfare. It seeps in like damp under doors, quiet, persistent, and undeniable." "And what about the manuscript?" He lit his pipe. "It never existed." I blinked. "But the notes, the verses, the registers." "Oh, those existed," he said. "But the manuscript, that refined, finished thing they feared, no, it was never real. It was the idea of the manuscript that terrified them. The idea that someone could piece it all together, so that someone could read between the lines." I glanced at the diagram still pinned to the wall above his desk. The stream of names, dates, and sentences, the red rope running through the lines, the ash-stained bit of Penrose's verse. "So," I said, "in the end, it's a story that wrote itself in absence." Holmes looked at me, a glow of warmth beneath his cold exterior. "No, Watson, this is a story we wrote, by refusing to let it disappear." It was 2 weeks after the final publication in the Gazette that I found Holmes sitting alone in our Baker Street parlour, his slender figure sprawled on the sofa, his hands cupped under his chin, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the ceiling. The fire hissed in the fireplace, not from damp coal but from the soft spot of a dying ember that seemed to echo the softened tension in the air around us. The storm, it seemed, had passed, without thunder or lightning, but not without consequences. "Have you noticed, Watson," said Holmes at last, "that a shadow never makes a noise before it moves?" I looked up from the pile of newspapers I'd been poring over, parliamentary columns, foreign affairs dispatches, and a rather dry obituary for a retired undersecretary that Holmes had marked with an X. "What do you mean?" Holmes tilted his head slightly, his voice distant. "We've stirred something, to be sure, but its movement has been subterranean. Adjustments made behind closed doors, names changed on ministry lists, offices quietly vacated. And yet not a single man has risen to answer a question in the House." "I guess that's what makes it infuriating," I replied, "to have brought so much to light, and yet so little officially acknowledged." Holmes smiled weakly. "Ah, But you always think in terms of courtrooms and headlines, my dear. Our adversary was never a man. He was a silent, faceless mechanism entirely devoted to his own preservation. He sat down, his expression sharpening. But even mechanisms can rust when exposed to light. And that, Watson, has always been the goal. Later that day, a small envelope arrived, delivered by a boy who didn't linger to collect his coin. The paper bore no insignia, no handwriting, only a scrap of card inside, neatly typed, "Letting silence rot is not preserving it." I looked. I doubted it. I believed. This is my last message. Maybe it's unnecessary. Holmes read it 3 times, then set it on fire without comment. The flames quickly caught the map, curling its black lace corners before engulfing it entirely. "Another employee?" I asked. Holmes shrugged noncommittally. "Or a minister's conscience?" He stood up and paced the room. "No name, no confession. But words matter." I thought so. The seeds are there now, Watson. In the soil of bureaucracy. In the minds of those who once dared not speak out. It may take years, but they will grow, and in the meantime? Holmes grabbed his pipe and slowly filled it. We wait, we watch, and we prepare. A few days later we were invited, curiously and unexpectedly, to the reopening of the Royal Literary Society's Penrose Gallery. Sir Giles Dunworthy, with his unusually cheerful manner, greeted us in the entrance hall with flushed cheeks and a nervous smile. "I thought it was time," he said, "to remind people what Penrose stood for." Saw. The gallery itself was modest. 3 rooms filled with personal effects, early essays, letters, and framed sketches from the late satirist. Among the exhibits was one curious object that Holmes paused over, a glass case displaying a torn, partially burned and barely legible piece of manuscript, not in ink, but in absence, not in words, but in wounds. They write silence as a law, and tie it with the ribbon of reason. "No attribution?" Holmes asked. Sir Giles joined us. "No, we couldn't confirm if it was Penrose's own handwriting, but we found it hidden in an envelope deep in the Society's archives. No signature, no date, and yet it seemed appropriate." Holmes nodded slowly. "Let him speak without a name, it's appropriate." We wandered through the rest of the gallery, lingering before a display of caricatures Penrose had drawn of anonymous politicians, easily identifiable to those familiar with Parliament, but cleverly disguised as allegory. Holmes paused in front, of one man in particular, a thin-lipped man armed with a shepherd's crook, guiding a blindfolded lion toward the edge of a cliff. "I think I met him," he whispered. As we walked home that evening, the gas lamps flickering in the icy twilight, Holmes fell unusually silent. I waited for him to speak, but he remained thoughtful, his brow furrowed, his lips pursed around an unlit pipe. Finally, just before turning into Baker Street, he said, "Do you remember, Watson, how it began? A letter, no return address, no signature, a warning. Of course, the letter that spoke of a theft, not of gold or jewels, but of something unwritten." "Exactly," he said. "A letter that we knew about before us. That predicted the disappearance of an idea. Tell me, what kind of person sends something like that, if not the thief or the victim?" I paused. "Someone in between, a witness." Holmes nodded slowly. "A witness who cannot be heard, or perhaps will not be, until the right ears are ready." He took a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, the last verse of Penrose's notebook that Bracknell had entrusted to him. They were afraid of the words I hadn't written. They feared the fire that I did not light. But they still saw the smoke and fled. For truth lives longer than the dead. Holmes folded the page and put it back in his coat. "There are some stories, Watson," he said softly, "that change nothing when told. And then there are stories that change everything when left. Tacit, we have experienced this last situation. That year, spring arrived quietly in London. The fog cleared. Earlier the air grew lighter, and even Holmes, whose mood often grew fragile with the brightening of the season, seemed more at peace. The manuscript that had never existed was now etched in history, not as a volume on shelves, but as a tremor beneath the polished floors of Parliament and the press. No more letters arrived. No more threats. The man with the umbrella did not return. Yet we knew we were sometimes watched by those who no longer feared exposure, but uncertainty. For the manuscript had become a ghost, not banished but wandering, always just out of the corner of my eye, still waiting to be rewritten by the next man with a pen and a memory. One afternoon I was returning from an errand and found Holmes at the window, reading a modest pamphlet freshly printed by the Gazette. It was unsigned, and its cover bore only a quote. "Let no one presume, let no one be trusted," I laughed. The first words of our anonymous correspondent. Holmes nodded. And now perhaps the last words of a movement. He put down the brochure, poured a measure of brandy, and turned to me. "Well, Watson, I think we've done our part. The rest, as always, is time."